come join us. Boom, right away, instantly. Okay.
Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld, thanks for being on the show.
Fantastic to be here.
Right,
okay. Dr. Kleinfeld, do you remember me from?
Of course.
Okay, there you go. All right. She's from the Truman National Security Project, of course, and you guys do national security, right?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite like that. We do national security writ large, so development, diplomacy, military as well, but all 3 Ds.
And what is the history of the Truman Center?
So we got started basically right around the time that Bush got elected again. And
Bush Jr.
Bush Jr.
Yeah.
Some of us had been working on the Kerry campaign and just felt like it was time for progressives to get their arms around national security. We couldn't keep losing on this issue. We couldn't keep ceding ground. We really needed to take it back. We had a good story to tell, but nobody was telling it. So many progressives shy away from security issues or don't go on the offense, don't want to fight back on it. And we said, look, America's going to get less secure and the rest of the world's going to be less safe if we don't change our policies, and it's up to us to make the case.
Do you remember last year that I made the interview a little awkward by talking about how you were really smart and attractive at the same time?
Oh, I do remember that.
Okay, here we are again. And
I'll take it as a compliment.
Okay, absolutely, absolutely. So hold on. I'm going to get to security in a second.
Okay.
So are you still single? Because I got to set you up. This is crazy. I'm married. Don't get me wrong. Okay.
My boyfriend would be very unhappy if you tried to set me up.
All right. I just wanted to make sure.
But thank you. I appreciate the offer.
Her boyfriend, Al Gore.
Just playing.
Okay.
So now let's get serious. Hold on one second. I'm going to jump in with the flow.
Well, you're not going to let me get serious? No, but I want to talk. Okay. I was going to talk big picture, and then we could go down to a little bit.
Okay, all right. Start with big.
So I want to talk about the idea. I love that that's what happened, that's the genesis of the Truman Center, because I love that you saw something en masse that people were upset about because the Democrats were not able to get traction on. How has that changed? Like, evaluate it today. Is the traction there? I mean, it seems like they're still labeled in the same way as soft on security, et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of that being your mission statement, how has that changed now?
Well, it's pretty amazing. If you look at the polls, Americans are actually giving Obama very high numbers in national security. It's one of the things he's doing best on, far better than on the BP oil spill.
Correct.
People really understand.
Which is national security, by the way.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
People understand that addiction to foreign oil is a problem for our security. They understand that Obama's trying to get us off this oil, whereas Cheney let the oil companies write our energy policy. They understand that Bush drove our economy into a ditch, and Obama's trying to dig us out of that ditch, and that's part of national security, to have a strong economy. And they get that we can't use the military for every single problem out there, and that Obama's doing a good job stewarding the military, helping them get pay raises and so on, but that he's also looking at our allies and looking at other groups to share the burden, and they like that. So Americans are giving him pretty good marks.
All right, hold on, let me jump into specifics, because you said something that I'm not sure I agree with. You said Obama is, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't think he's winding down any war. And so, because you said that the military is not the answer to every problem. Obama says that. We say that. We all agree to that, except Obama's answer has been military. Escalation in Afghanistan, Predator drone strikes, which, are really interesting, and I want to ask you about that, too, where you come out on that.
Sure.
But so far, we've had really just escalation.
Well, there's been a mix, right? So he's drawing down in Iraq. He's absolutely pulling troops out of Iraq, and we're on schedule to get out of Iraq as he wanted us to. So there's a real withdrawal, and the Iraqi police and the Iraqi military are doing a great job there. They've now got rid of 3/4 of al-Qaeda in Iraq have been captured. That's amazing, fantastic, and the Iraqi military is taking that on, and we're drawing down. In Afghanistan, you're right, he has pushed up the drones and really gone on the attack there. But civilian deaths are way down. So while the drone attacks, he's increased quite a bit over Bush. They've managed to really reduce the amount of civilians who are killed, which is important.
I'm curious where you guys stand, though. I mean, are you against escalation in Afghanistan? Are you for it? Let's take it one at a time. So let's start with that.
Sure. Well, I don't think it's the right question, with all due respect to the questioner. The question is, can we beat Al-Qaeda? And here you've got a president who they just took down the number 3 Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. They've killed over 650 of Al-Qaeda's top leaders. That's 3 times as many as the Bush administration did in its last half. So they're really going after this al-Qaeda infrastructure. And that's important. It's, I'm a progressive. My background is human rights and economic development. And you don't see a more godforsaken country than Afghanistan anywhere. So if you can stop the war there and stop the people who are trying to attack each other, that's a good thing from a progressive perspective.
That's a giant if, though.
That's a big if. People have tried to stop wars there now for decades and perhaps centuries unsuccessfully. They've tried to start them unsuccessfully and then stop them unsuccessfully.
Well, they've tried to do that all over the world, that's true. But we've got a president here who's actually working much better in his strategy than the previous president. So I want to give him a chance to see if he can make it work. They haven't even got all the troops there that were promised last year.
Okay, one last thing on that issue, which is, aren't the drone strikes really in Pakistan? And the killing of the al-Qaeda leaders, isn't most of our success with the drone strikes? Leaving aside the moral issues of the drone strikes. Mm-hmm. And so that leads you to believe, well, okay, then why are we bothering to do the escalation? Why are we putting so many troops in when the majority of our success is with drone strikes?
It's a great question. So basically, if you look at the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, it's like a huge pincher operation, like a vice. You've got a very open border there with mountains. People are crossing back and forth. The bad guys, al-Qaeda, are crossing back and forth. We can't go into the Pakistan side with our troops because Pakistan is a sovereign country. They don't let our troops in. But they're willing to let the drone strikes happen because the Taliban have been decimating Pakistan. They almost attacked the capital last year. They got within about 100 miles of the capital, really causing trouble in Pakistan. So the government's willing to let us do drone strikes there. So we do drone strikes on the Pakistani side to get rid of the al-Qaeda in Pakistan, and then we move our military into the Afghan side so that they can't just move like a balloon, from one side to the other as you push down. So that's the strategy.
Okay, then let's move on to the flotillas.
Yeah.
So obviously we had a massive international incident involving national security. Ours, the Middle East, everybody's, when the Turkish flotilla and others went into, well, they didn't go into Israeli waters, they were in international waters, and the Israeli commandos raided it. I'm curious, where does a group like yours, and we're talking to Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld from the Truman National Security Project, where do you come out on that? I mean, it seems like, all right, let me not inject my opinion. Just tell us what you thought.
It's one of the most tough issues out there. Israel has a real problem with Hamas and Hezbollah, and they have a right to check for weapons and so on. But the way they went about it was not only wrong morally to attack an unarmed ship, it was really stupid. And it's stupid for their own security. It's stupid internationally. Basically, Israel's facing an insurgency, a guerrilla war, just like we're doing in Afghanistan, frankly, a guerrilla war that we're facing in Afghanistan. You can't face that kind of warfare from Hamas and Hezbollah and so on with purely military means. What you do is you inflame public opinion overseas. You pour money into the coffers of the people who are against you because other people overseas get mad. They see the pictures on TV. You pour recruits into the other side, and you make your own problem much, much worse. And that's what Israel's doing with these strong-arm tactics against unarmed people. So leave aside the fact that it's wrong to attack unarmed people. This is really bad for Israel's own security, and they need to figure out how to fight this kind of guerrilla war much better.
Do you have a sense, Rachel, that Israel realizes this? I mean, because Netanyahu was elected fairly recently, and he was a known quantity. He was the guy that could do this. The country knew that. And now it just seems as if generationally, and just as time has begun to pass, that it's time for Israel to be outraged by this as well. I mean, that this is not their path. And taking very seriously what you just said, it seems like it's time for Israel themselves, the people of Israel, to sort of say, this is not how we want to go about fixing our problem, just sort of willy-nilly going out to sea and shooting a ship.
Well, if you look at their own newspapers, they are pretty upset. They're upset at their own leaders. And what you have there is kind of what we had in America under Bush. You had some of the country elect the guy, Netanyahu in their case, and a lot of the country really upset because Netanyahu, just like Bush, really divided Israel. And there's a big left in Israel that is very upset about how he's going about it. And there's a big middle in Israel that just feels like, just like I just said, this was stupid. This is a really bad way for Israel to do things.
And as your work is about security, what are the security ramifications of this event as it pertains to the United States? Just sort of thinking locally a little bit. I mean,
well, there's a lot of problems. First, in the Middle East, everyone assumes that everything Israel does was okayed by the United States, even when that's not true, and it's often not true. We don't control Israel, but in the Middle East they assume that we do. And so they assume that we allowed this to happen, and they'll assume that if something else bad happens that the Israelis do, it falls on our head. And that, of course, affects our own security. And we don't control Israel. We have very little control over this particular government, very little leverage. So it's a real problem for us. So
if you're advising the president, what direction do you push him in? Do you say, hey, you know what, you got to get tougher here on Israel because you're not helping them by constantly not checking the right-wing government that's driving them deeper into conflict? I mean, is that the direction you go? Or if not, what do you do? You know, how do you advise the president on something like this?
Well, he also has a political issue at home, of course, because there's a big Israel lobby in America, and they push in multiple different directions. But I would say Obama needs to have a talk with Israel, which is not about pushing them in one direction for the good of America, but is saying, look, Israel, if you want to keep your state, if you want to continue to have security, you need to change your tune and look at what we did in America when we got rid of Bush and brought in the current administration. Look at the way that we started approaching counterinsurgency. Look at the way that we started doing things better. You can learn, Israel can learn some from America, which is interesting because for years America learned from Israel how to fight this sort of thing.
Excuse me, Jack. I want to on that. Would you advise the president then? Would you have advised him to have been more outraged than it seems like he is to me? One of the things that frustrates me about this president is his lack of outrage, his lack of immediate outrage, that everything is measured. And I understand that there's a reason for the president of the United States to be measured in his or her approach. However, in this particular case, I want some immediate gut impulse stuff from this guy.
You want some heart and soul emotion?
Exactly.
Like, hey, could we have not killed those people?
Right. Thanks. Israel, that was ridiculous. I mean, I know that that plays into what you were just talking about the rest of the Arab world thinking that we are controlling Israel to an extent, because if we say, well, you come to us and ask us next time, of course that's not what we want out of Israel. Israel's not Alabama, but we should I do think that the president has to be reactive to send a message to the rest of the Arab world that we don't tolerate this either. And what is it about this White House, in your opinion, and what would you say to him if you were in that, following up on Jack's question, if you were in the Oval Office?
It's pretty easy to second guess the president. So yeah. I hate to do that because I think the guy's got a really tough job. I would not want his job.
I love doing that, but okay.
Yeah, and I think it's part of being a citizen is to second guess your president, or to try and make it better next time. Not to assail him only, but to say when BP happens again, like if somebody bombs a flotilla, react.
I was about to say that actually I think where he's saved the most emotion and probably should be spending it is on the economic situation. Mm-hmm. And we had a former President Bush who drove this economy into a ditch, and Obama just barely got us out of the Great Depression, take two, and he's still working like crazy to get us out of this ditch, and he's got a long way to go. And then you see the banks doing what the banks have been doing and so on. That's where a lot of the outrage needs to be, because for all of our national security problems abroad, the biggest one is here at home. If our economy doesn't get strong, we can't do anything that we want to do overseas. And Obama realizes that. It's why he's focused on the economy. But I'd like to see some more anger focused on some of the people who are taking advantage of this economic situation.
Someone wrote a good article. I'm sorry that I don't remember who it was, but that said, "Don't get mad, get even." Okay, that applies more to the economy and more to the banks, but action would be great. It's statements in the flotilla situation is very important, because that is our action in a lot of ways to the world, saying this is what we stand for. On the economy, I wish he'd take more substantive action. But let me touch on one last thing from my perspective on the Israeli situation. It seems that, it is, a great number of Jewish Americans are liberal, progressive. Mm-hmm. About 70% vote Democratic, probably after African Americans, the second most reliable bloc for the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. Yet their largest representative group, AIPAC, seems to be incredibly right-wing. They seem to push for the right-wing position in Israel every single time. And I'm wondering why the disconnect, and if anyone knows if there is a movement to say, hey, you know what, maybe AIPAC's not really representing the Jewish American groups.
Well, there was a fascinating article written by Peter Beinart in the New York Review of Books just a week or two ago about exactly this, and it actually took a Republican to point it out. Frank Luntz, the famous
Pollster?
Republican pollster, did a poll of young American Jews, and what they found was that young American Jews don't identify with an Israel that is brutal to the Palestinians and that is using these old school security tactics that don't work for Israel and are brutal and wrong. They might hearken to an Israel that went back to its founding principles and was more liberal and more open, and the kind of Israel that welcomed in the Vietnamese boat people, which it did back when, after they were kicked out of Vietnam. But they don't like this Israel. And the older Jews who are very connected with AIPAC, as you said, need to wake up to this, and they haven't yet. That they're losing the youth, and of course, you lose everything once you've lost the youth. So it took a Republican to point that out, and hopefully they'll sometimes wake up.
Now I remember why I had a crush on you.
Well, again, it's also going back to the fact what I was talking about before. It's a generational thing too. As young American Jews see, I think it's also. I used to think that it was that when the Holocaust survivors passed, it would change the tone. But it's really when the children of the Holocaust survivors get older and another generation comes up where it's not as immediate, the ability to criticize Israel is not, it's not the worst thing to do. It's that you can still love Israel and criticize Israel.
And I think, just to touch on that generational point, because the old school lived in a context where Israel's very existence was on the precipice constantly, right? So they feel like if you criticize Israel at all, you're endangering the existence of Israel. The new school realizes that's just not the case anymore. The world has changed.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think that there is still a significant number of people who feel that the preservation of Israel is important, but this is not necessarily the way to preserve it. That it is. I wouldn't say it's on the precipice. You're right, but there's always the chance when you're tiny, surrounded by enemies, and hated, that your elimination is possible.
Right. Well, there's two aspects of that. One way to go about that is to get less hated.
Right, but that hate is not the kind of hate that you can just, you can change by not bombing a flotilla. Had the flotilla not happened, all those people would have still hated Israel.
But if there's a peace, they don't have to hate Israel. I mean, over time.
That's a big overtime, and that's not something we're going to solve today. But I think what you're saying, what Rachel's saying, it's true. But I think that it has to be, the fact Israel's mere existence is always in doubt to a lot of Israelis.
Just last points from me, editorially, okay, is that, yes, but we've gotten to the point where you can criticize the actions of the government of Israel, as with any country, without thinking I'm endangering its existence.
Well, I think even more than that, you've gotten to a point where criticizing Israel is probably the best thing you can do for the existence of Israel.
Yes.
For those of us who really want Israel to exist and continue, it is the only democracy there.
We have a winner. We have a winner.
As usual, it's Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us and for putting out with me. We really appreciate it.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be on here. It's really fun, despite all of your comments.
Take care. Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld.
Thanks a lot.